Disclaimer: no data subjects were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Welcome to the Privacy Bar and Bants podcast. We make privacy awareness simple. Sit back, relax, and grab your darkest privacy myths and misconceptions. Your mind-boggling experience begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I love to drink what's in.
Well, anyway, so who am I? I'm yet in the industry.
Next question. Next.
Hi, I'm Amrita Nanda. I work with Aapti Institute. We're based in Bangalore, in India. On this episode of Privacy by and Bans, especially in honor of International Women's Day, we discussed a whole host of areas of thinking and questions around Femtech, both what it means to be a woman in the digital age, as well as what we are seeing as new innovation within Femtech.
So welcome to the podcast. It's nice to finally have you, and it's nice to finally record this episode. So we're recording this episode in honor of International Women's Day. Amrita, Astha, tell me, how does it feel to be a woman in this period, or what does International Women's Day mean to you as a woman?
I can go first, just on the fact that I'm a little bit older and I have more experience being a woman than Amrita, so I can maybe jump in. But I think it's quite a complex time to be a woman, and I'm also raising a 2-year-old girl at this point.
Aww.
So I often think about what it's going to be like for her, because I feel like our generation has been, we're millennials, and it's been a bit of a transitionary generation. So we actually have gone from being offline and, as I age myself, but I think I remember the landline and, I remember our first computer and things like that. But to my child, who is very much, as a 2-year-old, knows how to skip ads and give Alexa commands. So I think that has been an interesting, a generation for us in this time, because this ubiquity of technology and how we navigate it as people, but definitely as women, is something that we're all wrapping our heads around. And I think that it's been a lot to learn and a lot to reflect. And also living in India, we see that being a woman in this time is obviously not a monolith, because our experiences are so different from different parts of the country. So a lot to learn, a lot to wrap our heads around, and a lot of worry as well, as I think about all the harms that come towards women in the context of this digital age. So yeah, I don't know, Amrita, if you agree, and I sound very doomsday-esque.
No, I agree completely. Actually, you put it really well. I don't know when is not a complex time to navigate being a woman, from what I hear through various intergenerational friendships. But yeah, I agree on what we're navigating in the digital age. And I think also what I've felt very intensely is the compounding of just being marketed to a lot, which has always been a very separate way in which women are marketed to than men. And I see that happening so much more, and in younger women, like my nieces or cousins, and I can see the impact it has as well. So agree with everything you said, Astha, but yeah, it's not an easy time for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I really like that you're speaking about being a woman in the age of technology. I feel like that should have even been my question. How does it feel to be a woman in the age of technology? It's actually quite interesting, because there's a lot of stuff going on. There's so many new innovations in technology and all things interesting. And I think one of the concerns we have had, especially in the last few years, with AI being a whole thing, even much more than it was, is, the question of inherent biases and such and such issues, and how making decisions with AI could potentially have significant impact for historically marginalized communities, and that including women sometimes in some areas. So marginalized, or should say disadvantaged, or where the skills have been skewed away from women. I think that's another interesting area of being a woman in the age of technology. What do you guys think about that?
No, absolutely. I think both in the context of like I mentioned, how women are treated in terms of their digital identity or the data that is collected about women and how it's understood, but also the kinds of products that we see marketed towards women, particularly in the case of AI, right? I mean, I think like most technology and especially AI kind of compounds the existing inequities that we already are dealing with as a society. And when that goes unchecked, which is happening a lot in the case of AI, or is not thought of at the stages of design, it compounds in a very dangerous way. And I think when that's combined with existing inequities and the way that a lot of legislature is framed in a manner that's harmful to women, that further reduces their agency. The use of women's data has increasingly become a control tool, a way to even capture illegality, quote unquote illegality. And those same risks have been compounded a lot more. And more vulnerable women, like to Astha's point, living in India, we live a much more privileged life than most women in the country. And the visibility that being online and being digitally understood by corporations or by actors who are not necessarily thinking about what your lived experience looks like, that becomes a really dangerous place to be in, and to also have large cohorts of marginalized groups that don't that can't understand in many ways the impact from this data, which is not something that I think most people in the world really truly are able to understand, I think myself included. So yeah, it's a very concerning intersection, and I think it's one we need to think much more critically about going forward.
I mean, I totally agree with everything you guys have said. I like the fact that you quite mentioned the nuanced experiences that different women have to face based on where you're born or where they find themselves. I mean, sometimes I try to imagine being a woman living in the country maybe like 100 years ago, and I'm not sure I'm usually quite excited about the thought. But I mean, even now, there are so many struggles, or still many struggles. I mean, we've come a long way, right? But there's still so many struggles from maybe not even, for example, in AI, not accounting for enough data to even train, especially with regards to women, or just not accounting, or just very invasive technologies that are being developed to how we can really balance these things and how it affects women and their rights. I mean, there's just a whole lot, but I mean, always proud of being a woman. That's the first step.
Go
Yeah.
women, go women, go women.
But what you said about like thinking about the experience of women in 100 years ago, given the vastness and diversity of India, we always say India exists in multiple centuries at the same time. So there are pockets that exist from they are totally offline and disconnected, like it would be pre the internet age, to now where you can just scan a QR code and make a payment for a very small item, and so it exists at different levels. And what we've been seeing is that the fundamental struggles of women, which is navigating and negotiating with patriarchal systems, doesn't change. So in some of our work, we've been thinking about how women trust digital platforms. And the starting point to that work was about, okay, of course, everybody has a phone, and women are able to access and use phones. And therefore, we should start thinking critically about how they trust platforms. But then, of course, you go into the field and you realize that it's actually not true, and the numbers are slightly inflated. They say 31% of women have access to phones in India, smartphones, but the quality of that access is quite nuanced. So very many women don't have individual personal devices in the way that you and I understand phones to be our private devices, but are much more communal. So that changes their experience a lot. A lot of women want to, use the internet for education, to learn things from YouTube and all of that, but then are afraid of the impact it has. There's also a lot of this interesting chatter about how women will be corrupted by phones. And, it is they're going to talk to strangers, they're going to run away with strangers. And, there was a very interesting article a few years ago from India, which said that a lot of women who rely on their parents to introduce them to their former spouses, and, in this arranged marriage thing, they get screened for whether or not they have Facebook accounts, because Facebook accounts mean that you have access to all of these, new and interesting people outside your ecosystem. And that means you are therefore vulnerable to a certain kind of corruption, and a moral corruption.
But yeah, that was really insightful intro conversation, and we haven't even gotten to the meat of the issue that we're here to discuss.
So it's interesting because there's a few facets to what it means to be a woman in the digital age. So like we talk about how data is exchanged, or what you give up in exchange for your data and what you get in return. And then there's the interaction with the digital realm, which is what Astha was mentioning with what we found with our work with the digital trust, is how women perceive and how they are allowed to engage with technology as well. So it's quite a double-edged sword in that sense.
Yeah, that's quite interesting how society hasn't quite caught up with. And I think this sort of speaks positively of technology in a way. I feel like as much as it is the use of data and sometimes can be questionable and all that, I feel like it has also given and empowered women in certain ways that are really, really undeniable. I mean, even thinking health wise, I mean, that's one that's really popular. We see like women being able to take control of like their health in terms of understanding a menstrual cycle, understanding the recurrence of it, taking control of their reproductive experiences as well. And I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and from both ends, right? I think given the long history of biocolonial medical research, there is a lack of data on women's health and more broadly reproductive health. And so I think that market in some ways has been spotted and is being captured. I think I read recently that women are 75% more likely than men to embrace digital tools for their healthcare. And to your point, I think in a lot of contexts where women don't have that kind of free access to healthcare, these digital tools and platforms really provide that opportunity. At the same time, it is something that is perceived as a market, and the people building technology are not always privy to the long-term impact or the kinds of harms that can come from the way that this data is used, from the way that women's lived experience feeds into this data as well. And this is not just true of women, but gendered minorities as well. Anyone who, in an ideal situation, should be able to rely in a secure and responsible manner on digital tools like these. It doesn't always pan out that way, and I think we're at a bit of an inflection point where there's a lot of demand and also a lot of people building for the femtech revolution, as it were. But at the same time, in terms of thinking about data governance or what quote unquote ethical design looks like, it's still a very nascent field. So it's definitely at the stage that we can start to think critically about it and see what changes need to be made.
Before we go on, because I feel like we're tipping into the topic, I think we should do some of the podcast traditions. And I think I put it in the email to you guys, but there was one I didn't put in the email, which is we do this thing on the podcast called I Was Today Years Old Privacy Edition. So it's where you like say something that you didn't know about, that you found out recently, that's privacy related. And it would be great if it was privacy and women related, because I know you guys work in these sectors, and it's just an opportunity for us to learn as well as our listeners, so they can learn something new. There's so much information out there. It's best digested through a podcast.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very useful way to disseminate that information. It's definitely an easier way, I think, in this age. Just being someone who always wants to read more than I'm managing to.
Maybe I can go first. I guess a couple of things that I've recently learned about, I guess, women's existence online. So just in terms of like how bias occurs, and this is as one
learns is word of mouth and people's experiences, which you sometimes don't know how to pin down to a broader trend. But in when you're hailing cabs on ride-hailing platforms, such as Uber, Lyft, Ola, there are women in particular who experience that there is surge prices when it's late in the evening and your battery is low, which is different from the prices that a male colleague standing right next to you is also looking for a cab would experience. And obviously, there's no way to verify this information, but I know personally, and then I started digging around that this exists, and people have written about it a little bit basis their own experiences. But the fact that you do experience very very fundamental biases because of your gender, because I guess it is known that a woman who's looking for a cab late in the evening and is struggling with battery life will be willing to pay a premium for her ride versus a male colleague in the same position. So, I mean, I didn't learn this recently, but recent enough for it to be on my mind a lot.
Yeah.
And the other thing that, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I was just saying that this is a bit scary. Even the possibility of it happening, it's so much like a premium is being placed on your security as a woman, and that's
predatory pricing.
yes. And I mean, I think I'm going to begin to look out for this. It probably, in case it probably occurs here in Nigeria.
No, absolutely. And I think that, to know that somebody is commodifying or monetizing your vulnerability is actually quite a scary, scary thought. And then I guess the second thing, which is, at the point that I got cut off, was our fieldwork is opening us to the idea of the fact that so many women, young women who want to access digital platforms do so under masked IDs because they don't want their friends and families to know that they're online and that they're on whatever Facebook, Instagram, etc. So they actively mask their IDs. They do dummy sort of logins and things like that to access the internet, which is interesting to me on both ends because so much of grievance redressal, etc., around platforms is linked to the experience that you have online. But because women use masked identities, this is again like evidence that we're starting to see, they don't have access to that kind of grievance, but then also the different freedoms that they may enjoy. So this tussle between, like, again, making yourself vulnerable to harm because you're putting a masked ID out, but also understanding that masking comes with freedom, like that complexity to me has been quite an interesting one to navigate, and one that again we've been thinking about a lot.
That funny enough, I learned something new this morning from Amrita. Amrita, you mentioned about how 75% more women are 75% more likely to use health tech tools than men. I think that was very interesting as well. Quite interesting. I wanted to throw that in there. Something I also learned. So I was 2 years old when I learned that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to why femtech or reproductive health has been one of the biggest areas of innovation. But yeah, like I mentioned, I worry that a lot of that is not happening in a conscious or critical manner. And there's a huge market size to kind of be captured, and that's seeing momentum. And I think that a lot of women and myself included, we see a lot of value in, even at the level of a period tracking app, being able to understand something about your menstrual cycle, being able to make sense of these things, especially given that women's health, bodies, sexuality, physiologies are still not very well understood and also still hold a lot of social stigma. So there's a huge degree of agency in having a tool to understand it yourself, to be able to speak to that experience. But it comes with a lot of dangers as well. It comes with a lot of risks that we've seen emerging now for the past, I'd say, decade or so, or since the very beginning of the quote-unquote Femtech revolution. So yeah, it's definitely an inflection point, and I think there's a few ways in which we can envision a better future for Femtech. But I do agree that there's a lot of promise, and that is not lost, I think, on women using technology, as well as those building it. But there's a little bit of a gulf in how we need to be thinking about it, and who can play that role of thinking consciously and preemptively about how any of this information is used, how it's captured. There's been a lot of instances of period tracking apps that afford this kind of agency over yourself and your body and your health, sharing that data to third parties, not a lot of visibility around why or how it's shared, selling that as well. So it's really unfortunate to see these instances where something that could potentially be pushing the needle in how women are able to engage with their experiences being seeing this kind of double-edged sword, where it can be an extremely harmful thing.
Interesting stuff. It's very interesting. Okay. So before like I said, we keep moving closer to the topic, and I love it so much because the conversation is coming full circle. But before we move forward, I just want us to do this thing, which is a podcast tradition, where you tell us a myth that you would like to burst. I don't know if Amrita would like to go first. Any myth that you just think, what, that needs to be put in the trash and forgotten with and done. It's overdone. It doesn't need to exist. It's not true. That you'd like to share with us before we go on.
That's an interesting question and a tough one. I think one that I've been seeing a bit around a bit, and this might sound a bit roundabout, but is that personalized digital tools or precision-related digital tools cannot be safe and responsible. And I think the reason that I'd like to mention that as a myth that needs to be busted is because if the longer we believe that, the less we hold platforms, the less we hold the digital ecosystem accountable, because this innovation is happening. But we should want and expect for that to be in a more responsible manner. So I think that there is a tendency, and this is definitely from conversations I have around and a bit more colloquially, but there's a tendency to surrender to the idea that the exchange, the barter of privacy and human agency is a necessary part of relying on digital tools and services. But I don't think that that's true, or that it needs to be true. So that's my submission.
I mean, I totally agree. Thank you so much, Amrita. Before we go into the main conversation, do you have any privacy myth you'd like to share with us as well?
Yeah, I guess this is my favorite one, which I talk about all the time, which is that our digital experiences would have us believe that our personal data is just about us and impacts just us. But I think what we need to start thinking about is the fact that that our data is actually a much more relational and communal experience. So, we're all women on this call. Data about women in the world impacts us, the way that services and products and ads and things are targeted is not just because of our own atomized singular experience, but because we are typified and are put into buckets that are relational. So I think that's a big one for me, because all legislation, protections around privacy are very much about individual personal consent, individual personal privacy. But the way data is used in the current digital economy is actually much more communal. And I think that we need to start thinking about the way that we govern data much more communally as well.
I mean, I mean that couldn't have been more accurate. Thank you so much. And I mean, moving on to the main conversation now, I think I'll start with you, Amrita. Just really, I mean, with the kind of work that you do, I just want you to sort of talk about what femtechs are. I mean, from period tracking to menopause management, what roles do femtechs play in helping women and their healthcare? And I think maybe just really talking about how femtechs have revolutionized healthcare for women in recent times.
Yeah, I can maybe go first. I think that I maybe jumped the gun and spoke a little bit about this in some of my earlier points, but no, I think you put it well that there is a kind of spectrum of roles that femtech can play. I think there's a fair amount of contention on what constitutes femtech as well. Is it feminine tech? Is it feminist tech? And I think there's an equal amount of contention on whether we need to call out femtech as necessarily a subset within healthcare technology. Personally, I do think that it's valuable because there's been a dearth of data, of research, of fundamental understanding of women's physiologies. Historically and today, treatments are not responsive to women's pain, to their experience, to a true understanding of whether it's reproductive health or the physiologies of women and gender minorities. So I think that's kind of where femtech enters with this kind of promise to fill that gap in some way, to not only fill that gap as a question of more knowledge and information about women's health, but also as a way to afford agency to women in navigating these healthcare experiences. I think whether we think about polycystic ovarian syndrome or endometriosis, there are a lot of situations that women deal with healthcare providers, offline healthcare providers, and I speak particularly also from the Indian experience, where women's pain is not taken as seriously. A lot of these syndromes or disordered ways of functioning are not very well understood. So there's a lot of value to be found in having an entire layer of the ecosystem that is looking at what feminine tech can do for women. So the kind of roles that it plays, I think that you mentioned a few, right? Period tracking, managing. So there's an element of personalization to that healthcare. A lot of things that women experience on a day-to-day basis, having the ability to make sense of those, I would say, is one kind of broad category. And then that's often compounded with AI, with the ability to get personalized recommendations back to you. I think in that context, it serves as a great personal tool. But in a lot of contexts, particularly in developing contexts, it also plays the role of a very simple at the level of telemedicine, almost allowing women to have access to reproductive health care where they may not have it offline. So those are, I think, some of at the personal level, the roles that femtech can play. And I think there's a lot of examples across the spectrum to be found. But I think another way to think about femtech is, for example, using AI to augment ultrasound analyses to be able to predict breast cancer. So that's something that then happens at a large scale level. It happens as a part of a cohort of the scientific enterprise, but is hopefully something that trickles down to women's daily lived experiences, or at least the experiences of those that are stricken with an issue like that. So there's a few things. There's personalized health, but there's also this ability to make sense of large amounts of data. And I think particularly in the case of women, the ability to make sense of data that, has maybe been hard to understand in the past, even by the scientific community. So there's a few, I guess, ways in which femtech can play these roles. And this has been part of the kind of big promise or the sell of femtech, I think, from the get. yeah, it really offers an opportunity, I think, to use data in a cross-cutting manner, across disciplines, across different lived experiences, and in an ideal sense, the ability to mediate that digital experience yourself. I think that is maybe the one that most of us can relate to or have in some way, begun to encounter today.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've sort of just even expanded my own knowledge on the kind of opportunities that Femtech hold for women, and that's quite amazing. I think every time I learn something new, especially with regards to Femtech and how it affects the healthcare of women, it's sometimes it's exciting. I mean, except when you begin to think of the issues and how they can be solved, right? But I think Astha, I'd like you to sort of speak about also maybe just to shed some insights about how Femtech has revolutionized women's healthcare in your own opinion.
Yeah, so I think that what's quite interesting is that obviously, Femtech has emerged from an area of need, which is that women's experiences, particularly women's experiences with health, have been historically invisibilized. So, you don't see specific products coming up for men's health at the moment. It's because obviously a lot of women themselves, because a lot of femtech founders are thankfully women, do feel that, whether it's basic things like period tracking or more personalized telemedicine or, overall health and well-being stuff that Amrita highlighted, there was a huge gap when it came to understanding women's health. And there are numbers which I don't have at my fingertips, but about how deeply underfunded women's health and issues that specifically impact women are. So I think that what Femtech has done is actually given much more, has helped visualize women's experiences with regard to their own health. So whether it's from basic things, as we said, from period tracking to more maternal health to, whether it's fertility and menopause and all of these other things, I think it's really, really made a big thing. But also, I mean, I looked up some numbers. Femtech is still just about 3% of all digital health funding, which
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I did not know that myself till I was starting to read about for this podcast. But yeah, just 3% of all digital health funding, which is actually a really, really, really tiny sliver of what is, impacting half the population and is impacting potentially the future of our human race, because fertility and all of these things are linked to women's health, but is still deeply unfunded. So I think that there's an enormous amount of potential. There's also an enormous amount of potential for harm based on some of the issues that Amrita brought up about, like privacy, data security, what happens to this data, how do we keep it safe, how do we make sure that principles of feminism are anchored in the model, in the design, in the policy, in the culture, in the discourses of feminist technologies, of femtech, as Amrita said, could be feminine, feminist, based on where you stand. But I think that we're on a path. I don't think that we're at a point where I would say that it's revolutionizing women's health. I think that it is starting to empower women, to visualize their experiences, to make sure that we start to talk about what is the design of feminist technologies, and how that interfaces with, as we go up this crazy time of AI and generative AI, what does that mean as we start to think about feminist artificial intelligence as well? Because a lot of it is going to be anchored around the data that is generated from femtech apps. So how do we do that is going to be, that to me, I think is going to be the revolutionary lunge we need to make.
This is really interesting stuff, because you have said that like sort of the historical the historical evolution of femtech really came from the need to sort of highlight women's experiences, especially and the real demand really was driven by the healthcare sector, where it seems as if women's experiences are sort of suppressed or just excluded really, and not really given the amount of visibility required. And now we're moving, technology has come in sort of meet that demand or that need and fill that gap. But I was just wondering, are there what are some examples? I mean, for people who, just to put it in context for people who may be listening and are not sure what we're really talking about, what are some examples of femtech? And also more importantly, and advancing the conversation, I think I want to ask where do we see femtech moving into? What other sectors apart from healthcare do we see femtech moving into in the next, I say, maybe a few years? Or what new areas of femtech are emerging outside of the healthcare sector?
Yeah, we can keep passing the ball because I'm also thinking of examples. Like, I mean, I think you're right, a lot of people perhaps don't have a kind of clear conception around what constitutes femtech. Some of, I guess, the big ones have been some of the apps, the US-based apps, given also the conversation in the US around abortion and women's fundamental agency over their bodies. But there's also been a lot of response from the community to delete a lot of this information in light of the Roe v. Wade judgment. And so I guess some of the examples have been, like Flow, which was a period tracking app that ended up, being found out for sharing a lot of this data in very opaque ways and kind of commercializing that. I think at the same time, a lot of integrations, in my mind, excuse me, a lot of integrations to existing applications that we use for healthcare do constitute as femtech. And by that I mean technology that acknowledges your data categorization or your digital identity as a woman, and are gearing the response of that service to the fact that you're a woman. So I think there's a few ways that plays out. There's platforms that are geared towards the specific experience of women's health, as well as facets of existing tools and services that are trying to orient themselves towards quote unquote feminine lived experience. So yeah, I think those are, in my mind, some of the examples. And I think also perhaps to what I mentioned earlier about apps that also, and not just apps, but platforms more broadly that allow or enable greater access for women to existing healthcare, so are able to play that kind of connecting role or that bridge, especially in contexts where that access is not easily available, or maybe stigmatized, or maybe something that causes women a lot of harm to access in an offline manner. So it creates that online layer either to access healthcare or to understand your own healthcare. I think another example of the way that tech plays out is playing this role of fulfilling gaps in research. A lot of period tracking apps, Clue comes to mind, also have an element or the ability to sign up for your data to be included in clinical trials, in research that's taking place. And I think that's an area of digital agency that, personally, or I think more broadly, we haven't thought about a lot, but increasingly it is a very empowering notion to be able to contribute to research that you believe in. And some of the work that we've done in the past, and I think you'll remember, around data cooperatives for health data, found that when people are pooling their data and also guiding the direction that data gets used in, so what kinds of research priorities your data gets used in, people end up prioritizing innovations of treatment rather than innovations of cure. So, even in the case of a health data cooperative that we were studying that was looking to share some of this pooled health data for breast cancer research. The fact that people themselves were deciding on what gets prioritized meant that people were prioritizing research of processes. So what makes your treatment better? What makes your lived experience better? And typically what happens if if the use of this data is dictated only or primarily by larger stakeholders like research institutions or state actors or even the private sector, it's going to be oriented towards cure and towards the kind of things that get institutions laurels in healthcare. But I think the ability to also direct data in a way that creates this long-term understanding about the experience of you and a community that you belong to as women or gendered minorities. I think that's also an interesting way that health femtech is being used, and I think that's something we need to think a little bit more about, because in my mind, a lot of what femtech is hoping to solve for, or that we hope will someday solve for, are systemic issues in gaps in knowledge. So the kind of an overt focus on personalized healthcare may not be the only way to push that impact, but also to think about how do we create a sustained kind of longitudinal effect of women or gendered minorities being able to direct that information that's being gathered about them. So yeah, a bit of a long answer and maybe not so many concrete examples, but yeah, of course.
No, I like this because you've sort of answered a future question we were asked, which are like, I mean, just discussing, highlighting the importance, I guess. So because I feel like a lot of times when we have conversations, especially around data protection and technology, oftentimes we don't really see, we look at the responsibility of the processing. We don't necessarily talk about the benefits and the advantages and the uses. And I think this is very important when it comes to talking about women and tech. But I just wanted to ask, Astha, do you have any other ones you want to add? Maybe any new areas that, we're exploring or moving into with regards to femtech outside the healthcare sector? Or would you like to add any other like interesting examples that you might know of? I mean, I've heard of an LV trainer that's like a Kegel trainer for strong pelvic floors for women postpartum. So that was very interesting. I don't know if there are any other ones that you might have or want to add.
Yeah, I think that I'm quite interested in the expanding definition of femtech as well. So how do we, include more gender diverse communities also this? So how do we design from the feminist principles applications and healthcare applications for, LGBTQ plus populations? How do we look at certain communities, certain kinds of groups that have been underserved? So how do we look at low-income groups and look at their healthcare needs, and women in low-income groups and their healthcare needs? So I think that, or, certain racial minorities within communities. So I think that there's a lot to unbundle because of the complexity of women are not a monolith. They're certainly not a monolith globally. They're not a monolith within countries. And so how do we use the principles of feminist technologies, of feminist design, and start to build for much more nuance around groups that have been traditionally underserved? And I think that as we start to, if we want to start thinking about that as a starting point, I think very interesting conversations can open up. So, how do we improve diagnosis for certain kinds of communities, which have a greater disease burden, for instance, of, I don't know, sickle cell anemia among women, or female genital mutilation, which exists in different parts of the world. How do we use technology to address these issues that impact women, but are not getting enveloped through the overarching fundable, the glitzy stuff that is currently femtech? Yeah. So I think that there's yeah, exactly. So I think that there's definitely, like, fertility to me is a really, really big part of what femtech is starting to address. But then, anybody who has been through the cycle of fertility, which is a lot of my friends will tell you that it's actually an extremely disembodying experience. So how do we use technology to address some of that? And I think to build on what Amrita said, which a lot of these femtech apps are doing is to build around solidarity, around intersectionality, around this sort of participation from groups of women, so that there's greater agency around how technologies are built and used and are actually addressing very specific needs of women. So I think that newer sort of areas and newer topics will reveal themselves if we start to think of technologies built for women, by women, with women, and actually look at cooperatives, for instance, are an example that we love very much, because every time that we are talking to women's cooperatives about the data that they use and don't use and need and don't need, we come back with having obviously like broken down our own impressions, our own hypotheses, and very much able to learn about what is actually necessary. And so giving women that kind of agency over their narratives around the types of technologies that are built to solve issues, and health is definitely a starting point. But much more than that. And I think that that's also what we're trying to see, is that how do we use existing femtech platforms to then enhance agencies and bring forth issues that impact groups of women, and then how do we build around that?
That's really interesting stuff. I mean, there was something said earlier about some of the risks. I mean, I love that we've spoken about the good stuff, right? I just want us to get into the gritty, the not so pretty stuff. So I mean, you've mentioned some of the concerns, responsibility, even in the idea of cooperation and this utility of the data potentially generated from these femtech platforms. So I want us to discuss a bit about that. So Amrita also mentioned earlier about the issue with abortion in the US, and the role that femtechs are playing in I guess the governance of anti-abortion laws and all that. I want us to discuss a bit more about some privacy concerns and risks that femtech pose, especially with regards to women. I mean, yeah, and that are more unique to the female experience that we ought to be concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can start there, right? What we spoke about in the case of abortion laws in the US, and how varied that is now across states, and just what a concerning situation that is to be in as a woman. Or countries like Iran, or I think really anywhere where legislation can and that's global, right? Legislation can always turn, political interest can always turn. And the promise of technology, and I'm going really back to basics here, but the promise of the internet, even to begin with, was this vision of democratization, of access, of being able to engage with the world in the way that you see fit, with no kind of with no essential harms related to that. And that's not what we see playing out instead. So I think the call from, for example, from Google employees to delete a lot of the data, for huge calls from an entire community of women and gendered minorities in the US to call for the deletion of data from period tracking apps, came off the back of people who have, for example, been charged with second-degree murder for choosing to terminate their pregnancies. So I think those are a few but extremely concerning examples that should tell us that we really need to kind of look up and learn from the fact that if technology is being built to enable, the very least it should do is not create greater harm. So a lot of femtech, I think, stands the risk, not even stands, it has borne the risk of acting as this kind of tool or conduit to capture illegality, something that can be twisted kind of at the hands of state interests. And that's a really concerning place for us to be in, especially if these are if this is a new digital layer that we're building or a new sector that's being built, I think that's the time to do so mindfully. So I think that's one of the overarching concerns that I have is how this plays out and who has access to this data, I think becomes the most important question. There are other concerns that I think mirror a lot of other technology that tends to or has aged somewhat inequitably. The kind of deep misinformation that can result from the biased reading or understanding of the data or digital self that we put in to these platforms, right? I think the inherent bias given the kind of systemic patriarchal structures that we exist within globally does mean that is filtered into the way that a lot of technology is designed. So I think to Astha's point earlier as well, that we need technology designed for women and by women. For that to happen, or the reason for that to happen, one of the reasons is so that we can start to mitigate some of this, which is not to say that bias still can't creep in, but I think that perhaps taking a considered and a kind of staggered approach to how quickly we jump into innovating without really thinking about the impact is really, really important. I think, I guess those are the two main categories of risks that I see, that can be really, really harmful to women who exist within ongoing societal stigma around their bodies, their health, and around how much agency they are afforded over it. So, yeah.
I mean, thank you so much. I totally agree. I mean, you guys have drawn quite a huge connection between traditional concerns that women have had over time to now how this is being translated online with digital products. And I mean, and with all the issues you've raised around data governance, I mean, who owns the data, who controls it? I mean, I want you to, maybe coming to you, Astha, now. Maybe this question is for you. I want you to sort of speak on how or why data protection is important with regards to innovative Femtech products, right? And I mean, particularly considering that, I mean, this data that's being collected or processed on these apps or these products are sensitive personal data, right? So, I mean, why or how important is data protection and probably ethical practices or data governance? How important is it to the use of Femtech?
I think that it's really critical, right? Because again, as we've been sort of skirting around this issue, we are looking at artificial general intelligence, where we are producing data that we don't even know how it might be used or where it might be used. And so I think that in that context, it becomes very, very important to have data protection that is anchored on individual rights as we know it can be, but also, as I've been saying, on communal or collective rights. And that needs to be unbundled a little bit more. I think that's also something to be said about how we think about some of the major issues that come from not having a good data protection, right? Which is that, data can be monetized by bad actors. We know that, for instance, health data is some of the most valuable data in the dark web because it can be sold to insurance companies, it can be sold for ads, it can be sold for very many things. So how do we also make sure that we are able to meaningfully consent, we're able to exercise agency, we're able to understand purposes and how they might be used, we're able to make sure that we can, I guess, band come together around our data and also draw value from it. So direct it for research. If I am putting data onto a Femtech app and I suffered, I don't know, a common polycystic ovarian syndrome, then maybe some of that data can be donated to researchers who are looking at things like PCOS. So how do we so to me, data protection is not just about privacy and protection. It's also about making sure that there's space for negotiation, there's space for that interaction and to draw value, to direct data. So it's much more about agency over data. And, a lot of the work that we've been doing around more bottom-up mechanisms of what we call data stewardship are actually focused around that. So Amrita mentioned data cooperatives. That's, an idea that we like very much at Aapti. So how do we get people, women in this case, to come together to take the existing laws and legislations that exist at our disposal, and how do we use them to enhance our own agency over data?
Thank you so much, Astha. I mean, that's quite interesting. I love the fact that you talked about the fact that, it's important that data is also used for purposes such as research. Because this kinds of research sort of enhances healthcare for women and generally, right? And I think that's pretty great. What really matters is how, data should be used, right? What really matters is how it is being used, right? And what sort of processes or practices or procedures are in place to ensure that the data is used ethically. And still sort of bouncing off this conversation, Amrita, I want you to speak a bit on how sort of privacy concerns in Femtech intersect with broader issues and broader conversations around gender bias and inclusivity in tech.
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question. I think that when it comes to data privacy, especially in the context of gender and Femtech, as we've been discussing, there are some table stakes, right? There's GDPR, there's HIPAA, but I think like with most areas where you want to see something a bit more revolutionary, you want to see something that's undoing existing societal inequity, you need more than that. So I think there's to your point about gender bias, or I think there's something to be said about going definitely beyond regulation, to think about structures, communal structures, like Astha mentioned, community structures that can actually support the mitigation of some of that. I think the way that gender biases are playing out, especially in AI, it's, to be frank, it's not something that as an ecosystem we could not have predicted, but it is definitely something that we can still kind of work to mitigate. And I think that doesn't happen through data security or privacy alone, but through building lasting structures for both accountability and also for meaningful or mindful design of these systems. So I really do see that as a 10 to 20 year question. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's something we are able to kind of eradicate in the now, but I think it's something we build for at the moment. The way that gender bias is playing out within AI, we see this, through some very interesting research that's coming out about the ways that a ChatGPT or a lot of large language models are able to respond or make sense of women's experiences, or the correlations that they draw, for example, between career choices and women. And this is something that we saw very early on before the kind of AI boom as well, in the way that digital products were marketed to women. So that was, to, I guess, circle back to my very first mention or comment in this conversation, the way that women are treated digitally is very, very different and needs to be, I think, thought about by women, but also needs to be thought about for women. So I don't want to, I guess, leave us on a very bleak note, but I definitely see the mitigation of some of these biases as a longer term solution. I think that we shouldn't rely on regulation alone. There's only so much about our kind of socioeconomic structures that regulation or legislature can capture. And I think if we hold platforms or people building tech or people, deploying tech accountable only to those standards, then, we lose out on the opportunity for data to see its true potential, which I think is to, rebalance a lot of existing inequities in society. So yeah, I guess as we think about Women's Day, I hope that we can ask for more, and go beyond, at least in digital context, we can go beyond thinking about the privacy and security, though I think that that's always the first premise, and that has to, and that needs to be secured away, so to speak. But I think that, the promise of whether it's Femtech, whether it's AI, we should hold on to that, but we should do it in a way that that builds towards more equity, and that's not, I think, a short or an easy fight to fight.
Yeah. I think especially so. I mean, one of the things that I and I understand, as we said, these femtech businesses or products have to run and have to function. And we spoke a bit about financing and how only 3% of them are financed, and so really the only way to generate like income or solid income that could potentially attract the appropriate investors is to go big commercially. So then I ask, is there a way to actually ethically commercialize femtech while still guaranteeing that user trust that we require?
Yeah, that's a tough question. My instinct is let's not. And my instinct is not that it's not possible at all, but I think, and this is how I feel for a lot of personal data, especially sensitive personal data. There are ways to monetize data that aren't fundamentally harmful to people. I think of a few examples around data cooperatives where, data that's been pooled can be aggregated, anonymized, really thoroughly de-identified, and then, for example, shared with, state agencies to make better informed policy decisions. So that's an interesting one. And then I think of an initiative in India, Safety Pin, which I wouldn't say is monetizing that data, but I'm thinking about the value of collecting data and then being able to use it to affect policy changes or affect, how we're structuring our societies at a micro or even a local level. So I think it's possible. I think that perhaps the way it's happening right now, being perceived by a lot of people who are buying, selling, collecting that data, isn't ideal and is definitely, especially dangerous in the context of femtech. So I think there's a way to do it. I think what that will need to look like is, it's going to have to be a little bit at scale. Perhaps something similar to the point I made earlier on how data can be used for research. I don't think that personalized data, granular data about women's health, should or needs to be monetized, or commercialized. And I think for me the biggest ethical challenge there is that today most, or not even most, but the primary or first jump commercialization of data basically means that you are going to be sold something based on what you've shared as part of your digital self. And that bothers me so deeply when it comes to especially women's healthcare, because like we spoke about, we're talking about something that's filling a gap that for community that has not been visibilized and is still not being visibilized adequately. And for I think there's no argument at all to be made to take that visibilization of it happening from personal agency and turn that into profit for somebody else. And that's where that's a very personal stance for me, but I do maintain that there is a way to use this data to make sense of it, and there may be monetization attached to that. But when it comes to the cut and dry commercialization of it, which we do see happening, we see it happening without women's consent or the consent of data principles. That just that doesn't sit well with me, especially given the context that women are coming from in needing and wanting to access some of these digital health tools. it's just it's very unfortunate, I think, in my mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Amrita. I think, I understand your sentiment or your opinion, because the truth is, it really makes it dicey when money comes into it. They say money makes everything more complicated. So that's actually a very interesting position that you have. I don't know. So looking towards the future, I was just wondering, what are some of the emerging trends or innovations that we can expect in femtech, or at least the ones you're optimistic about,
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't want to, I guess, be too prescriptive in how I situate that answer, but I mean, I think I'm optimistic about a lot of what we've been seeing more generally in the realm of communities organizing around data. I think that's something that I really hope to see more of. I hope for the femtech sector to see a lot more collective action. I think that's something that societies win by doing. I think that we've seen that in the case of other data. We've seen a lot in the case of health data, but I think that femtech is at this point where, right now at least, it's seen very much as a digital solution. There's some kind of a drive to build. I mean, it's set to be like some 50 billion USD market next year, which in my mind only tells me that people are excited to build, but I don't know if that's happening in a collectivized manner. I don't know if it's happening in a even collaborative or consultative manner. So I think this is more of a hopeful than a prediction, but I hope that some of what we see happening in the digital ecosystem in other realms and other sectors finds its way here as well. I also think women are good at collectivizing and have had to do that for centuries. So I would, hope and love if that were to happen in this context as well. There's incredible women across the board working, not just in tech, but more broadly, to make sense of how the new tools available to us can help women going forward. So yeah, it's a very unfortunate situation that right now there's a lot of building happening, but at the same time, a lot of that is not being able to be done by women. While there's this huge market set to see, this huge number in 2025. At the same time, and I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, but there's a huge dearth of venture capital funding for femtech. And the main reason for that is, in my understanding, and I think in a lot of other people's as well, is that funding does not respond to women founders or gender minorities. So I think that tussle needs to start untangling a little bit, and I would love to see the kind of collectivization around data that has been happening in some other sectors to also find its way here. So for this to be a by women sector as well as a collective effort. So I think that's what I hope for, and I think that those will feed into the other tools we talked about, like AI. It will feed into how we build towards reducing bias in AI and being preemptive about it rather than solving once risks have seen themselves played out. And I definitely, I think, but I'll say hope just to not be too descriptive about it. And, who knows? Yeah, to qualify it, because you never know. But I think, the last point on this answer, I think, is just that a lot of the really lived harms that we've seen from changes in legislation and what that means for data that women have shared, I really, really hope that we learn from that, and that there is a shift in the tone, in the orientation, and in how we design femtech at all. It is possible to safeguard data from design, to have privacy by design, so that tomorrow changes in external circumstances and regulatory circumstances will not put women and gender minority in harm's way so critically, So yeah, those are a few of my predictions with qualifiers.
I think also looking forward to having more funding for Femtech and definitely implementing things around privacy by design and ensuring that women's data is being safeguarded. But this is my last question, and I think maybe to just wrap up the episode. I mean, and I know you've spoken a bit about this or you've touched a bit on this. I just think I'd like you to just maybe in a minute just share what you envision is the ideal balance probably between innovation and privacy and data protection for users. What do you think is what do you think are the fine lines, or what do you think is the balance between both?
Yeah. I guess my answer is that I don't think it should be a balance. I think that privacy and some of those rights of data subjects should be the table stakes, should be a given, and innovation must build on top of that. I also think that there's something to be said about innovation around privacy. We see very interesting privacy enhancing technology that's coming out, that's being conceptualized, being deployed. I guess two things is that we don't, I think, need to balance the two. I think we need to take privacy as the premise of any kind of innovation. And I think we also need to innovate around privacy. I think that technology's role as being this potentially, the great equalizer, that can be realized through just the way that technology is designed, the way that privacy is prioritized in earlier stages, and can create this incredible sort of bubble where no external circumstances will be able to break that, to take away that agency. I really, somewhere still believe in the promise of technology as playing that equalizing role. So I think that we need to innovate around privacy as well. And I think that, we should do that and also remain hopeful about other kinds of innovation. Like you said, it's exciting to see what kinds of really interesting femtech tools are going to be available to us. I think as women, we've always learned to rely on our own knowledge and other women's knowledge and the knowledge of our experiences and generations of women to understand the experience of being a woman. So, to have more tools to do that is something that excites me as well. So I really look forward to that innovation. I hope that we also innovate around privacy, and I hope that we can create, I guess, almost a digital version of what I think women across the world have found in other women, which is, a sense of collective camaraderie and the ability to make sense of experiences when a lot of the world is kind of set up against you. So I think that as we innovate for women and gendered minorities and try to understand how we can have greater agency, I think we should also do it in a privacy enhancing manner and just take that as the first premise and go from there.
Thank you so much, Amrita. I mean, this has been quite an insightful episode, and I mean your last answer about how innovation needs to give way rather than it being sort of like a balanced right position. I mean that's quite interesting. Thank you so much. It's really been insightful, and we're so happy to have had you on the episode.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a really lovely conversation.
Yeah, it has been an
Sorry, I cut you off there.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I was just saying it's been a really insightful episode. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Privacy Bomb Bands family. We're glad to have had you on this episode. You and Astha as well.
Lovely. Thank you so much. It's really been a lovely conversation and a very warm start to my day as well. So happy to be part of the family, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. And yeah, thank you again for having us.
Until next time.
Yeah, it remains our lovely DPO and I, Itunde. This episode was sponsored by Ikigai Innovation Initiative and was brought to you by Tech Hive Advisory.
And a big shout out to our executive producer, Ridwan Oluyede, associate producers, Dolapo and Yetunde.
This podcast was edited by Ayonfe Aino, shout out to her, and our podcast associate, Victoria Adaramola, and graphics by Okwe Abujade.